The air above northern Germany was a frozen void, a place where sunlight turned to glass and sound dissolved into the wind. It was late 1943. The contrails of hundreds of American bombers streaked across the blue-white sky, their engines droning like an advancing storm. Below them, in the haze of flak bursts and the silver shimmer of altitude frost, German interceptors clawed upward. Bf-109s and Fw-190s, sleek, angular, built for precision and speed. Their pilots were veterans of countless kills. They had met Spitfires, Hurricanes, and the fragile early American escorts before. None had truly frightened them. But this time, something different waited above. A new sound tore through the thin air, deeper, rougher, almost mechanical thunder. It wasn't the song of a Merlin or the whine of a Daimler-Benz. It was the roar of a radial engine, the Republic R, 2800 double Wasp. Then came the silhouettes, massive, broad-wing fighters diving at impossible speeds. The sky turned into a furnace of tracers and vapor trails. For the first time, Luftwaffe pilots found themselves hunted. And that machine, the American P-47 Thunderbolt, would change everything. By the spring of 1942, the air war over Europe had reached a deadly equilibrium. The Royal Air Force attacked by night, shadowy bombers feeling their way through searchlights and flak toward the heart of industrial Germany. The United States Army Air Forces, newer to the theater, brought a different philosophy: daylight precision bombing. It was bold. It was mathematical. And, at first, it was nearly suicidal. The B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator, proud in name and spirit, filled the skies with hope and aluminum. They could fly high, they could take damage, and they could fight back, but only to a point. Once beyond the limited reach of their escorts, they became slow-moving targets for the Luftwaffe's sharpest blades. The Luftwaffe of 1942 still stood tall. Its fighter arm, the Jagdwaffe, was battle-hardened from years of dominance over France, the Low Countries, and the Eastern Front. It had perfected the art of interception. Radar chains spotted inbound bomber streams, flak softened them up, and then waves of Bf-109s and Fw-190s tore into the formation. German tactics were disciplined, their communication efficient, their experience unmatched. For the Americans, the question was simple but deadly: how to get their bombers to the target and home again. At first, the solution seemed clear: fighter escort. But the early models, the P-38 Lightning and P-51A Mustang, lacked the range to accompany bombers deep into the Reich. Even the Curtiss P-40, rugged and brave in the Mediterranean, simply couldn't survive in the high, thin air over Central Europe. So the bombers went alone. On missions to Bremen, Regensburg, and Schweinfurt, the results were catastrophic. In one day, August 17, 1943, of 376 bombers sent to Regensburg and Schweinfurt, 60 were lost. Hundreds of airmen didn't return. Crews began to call it Black Thursday. The problem wasn't courage, it was mathematics. Escort fighters had to turn back before the bombers reached their targets. Beyond that invisible line, the Luftwaffe waited in layers. They would attack in coordinated climbs, slashing through formations, exploiting the bombers' predictability. It became clear that without long-range, high-altitude fighter protection, daylight bombing might not survive. Yet, across the Atlantic, in the Republic Aviation Plant in Farmingdale, New York, a different kind of machine was being born. The P-47 Thunderbolt began as an engineer's challenge, a fighter that could carry a massive turbo-supercharged radial engine and still perform at altitude. It wasn't sleek. It wasn't elegant. In fact, early test pilots joked it looked like a milk bottle with wings. But beneath its bulk was brute power. The Pratt Whitney R 2800 double Wasp engine, 18 cylinders of controlled violence, could drive the Thunderbolt to over 400 miles per hour at 30,000 feet. Its turbo supercharger, mounted deep in the fuselage and connected by complex ducting, allowed it to breathe in the thin stratospheric air. Where other engines gasped, the Thunderbolt roared. It was the heaviest single-engine fighter of the war, nearly twice the weight of a Bf-109, but was also the toughest. Armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks, and redundant control systems made it a survivor. When the first P-47BS arrived in England in early 1943, they were met with skepticism. Pilots from the 4th and 56 fighter groups found it heavy, sluggish to climb, and complicated to manage. The turbo lag frustrated many, especially veterans from lighter aircraft. But their commanders saw something else: potential. In the months that followed, the Thunderbolt evolved through blood and experience. It was pushed higher, flown faster, and armed to its teeth with 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns, 4 in each wing. It was a skybound sledgehammer. By mid-1943, these new fighters began to take their place beside the bomber streams. Their role was simple but monumental: hold off the Luftwaffe long enough for the bombers to strike their targets. The Germans soon learned that the bulky silhouette of this jug, as American pilots nicknamed it, was not a sign of weakness. It was a warning, because when the P-47 dove, it was unstoppable. And as the Allied command realized how much power this machine held, a new question emerged: how far could it go? The P-47's greatest strength was its power. Its greatest weakness was its thirst. In the early months of combat deployment, Thunderbolts flying from bases in England could escort bombers only as far as the Dutch border. Beyond that line, the B-17s and B-24s flew into German territory alone, where the Luftwaffe waited. Fuel, therefore, became as critical a weapon as firepower. Republic's engineers and the U.S. Army Air Forces staff began experimenting with drop tanks, external fuel canisters that could be jettisoned when empty. At first, they were crude, paper tanks made from compressed wood pulp coated in resin. Fragile, leaky, and flammable, yet they worked. Each extra gallon meant another mile into the Reich. It was a logistical puzzle as much as a tactical one. Supply chains had to move tanks from American factories to English airfields. Pilots needed new training to handle the additional drag and the changing weight distribution as tanks drained mid-flight. Maintenance crews rewired fuel systems and reinforced pylons under the wings. But gradually, the P-47's leash began to lengthen. By the autumn of 1943, Thunderbolt groups could reach targets deep into northern Germany. It was a turning point, not just of geography but of psychology. The Luftwaffe had grown accustomed to timing their intercepts precisely, attacking when bomber escorts turned home. Suddenly, that rhythm vanished. The Germans began encountering Thunderbolts where they didn't belong: over Münster, over Bremen, and later, near Hanover. They were confused at first. Amerikanische Jagdflugzeuge hier. German intercept controllers asked in disbelief over the radio. American fighters were supposed to turn back. But now they stayed. And when they stayed, they hunted. The P-47's dive performance was its secret weapon. Its weight, which had seemed a liability in climb and maneuver, became its greatest asset in steep descent. Luftwaffe pilots, used to dictating altitude and attack angles, found themselves pursued by an aircraft that could drop faster than anything they had ever seen. A Bf-109 pilot, Lieutenant Wilhelm Reuschling, would later describe the experience. They fell like stones, yet they moved like demons. You could not follow, only watch. The Thunderbolt's 8.50 caliber Brownings tore through enemy aircraft with terrifying effect. Unlike the German cannon bursts, slower, fewer, but heavier, the American guns spat streams of fire that filled the air. Their harmonization patterns created a lethal cone of lead at convergence range. A half-second burst could rip apart an FW-190's wing. Each gun carried 425 rounds, over 3,000 bullets per aircraft. It was a doctrine of volume and precision through density. Yet power alone was not enough. Tactics evolved daily. Colonel Hubert Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, known as Zemke's Wolfpack, was one of the first to understand the P-47's unique personality. He ordered his pilots to fight vertically, not horizontally. Climb high, dive fast, and use altitude as both sword and shield. Energy fighting replaced turn fighting. Survival came from momentum, not luck. Zemke drilled discipline into his men. Formations had to hold tight. Communication had to be crisp. Every engagement was studied after landing. Errors weren't punished, they were analyzed. The result was a fighting unit that operated with mathematical precision and predatory instinct. The P-47, once doubted, was now feared. By late 1943, Thunderbolts had begun fighter sweeps, Frey-jagged, beyond bomber escort zones. They targeted Luftwaffe airfields, railway lines, and interception routes. Each mission weakened Germany's defensive rhythm a little more. Still, the war in the air was far from over. Even as the P-47 gained reach, the Luftwaffe remained dangerous. German pilots like Adolf Galland and Gunther Roll still controlled seasoned wings. Their tactics adapted. They began attacking bomber formations from head-on, reducing exposure to escorting fighters. The Thunderbolts, meanwhile, fought to extend deeper into Germany with newer 150-gallon and later 200-gallon tanks. Then came intelligence orders, Operation Argument, soon to be known as Big Week, a coordinated assault on the German aircraft industry. For the first time, the P-47 would not merely defend bombers, but actively suppress the Luftwaffe itself. The stage was set. The sky over Europe was about to become a battlefield of endurance, technology, and sheer willpower. And the P-47 Thunderbolt, once dismissed as too big, too heavy, too crude, was about to prove it was exactly what the Allies needed. For the men who flew it, the P-47 Thunderbolt was more than a machine. It was a fortress with wings. Pilots climbing into its cockpit described it as stepping into a vault. Thick armor behind their heads, reinforced glass in front, and rows of dials glinting in the morning light. Inside, the R-2800 double Wasp engine shook everything, not violently, but with a deep, confident tremor of raw strength. When the throttle advanced and the propeller blurred, the pilot could feel the torque pulling against his shoulder harness. The Jug, as it was affectionately called, didn't leap off the runway like lighter fighters. It lumbered forward, steady and deliberate, gathering speed until the Earth finally fell away. The climb was slower than the sleek Spitfire or nimble Bf-109, but once the Thunderbolt reached altitude, its demeanor changed. It became a sky-born predator. Pilots often recalled the strange calm in that high, cold world. Oxygen masks crackled with radio chatter, frost crept along canopy edges, and sunlight refracted through contrails like ghostly ribbons. In those moments, the P-47's size became a comfort. Many airmen owed their lives to that weight. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group was one of them. During a mission in June 1943, his Thunderbolt was attacked by a Messerschmitt Bf-109. Cannon shells shredded the canopy, tore holes in the fuselage, and destroyed control cables. Oil covered his goggles. His oxygen system failed. Yet the Jug kept flying. Johnson managed to limp across the channel and crash land in England, alive. His aircraft had taken more than 200 hits. Stories like his spread quickly through the ranks. Pilots began to trust the P-47 as they trusted no other plane. It was heavy, yes, but was dependable. That confidence changed behavior. They began to take calculated risks, diving deeper, staying longer, and chasing enemies where others might have turned home. The Thunderbolt's survival rate became its legend, and its legend fed the morale that powered the American Air War. In air combat, altitude is life. The P-47's design made it the undisputed king of the dive. Hub Zemke recognized this from the beginning. He trained his squadrons not to fight on the enemy's terms, never to turn with the nimble German fighters. Instead, they used altitude as energy and energy as a weapon. The tactic was brutally simple: stay high, strike fast, and escape even faster. Thunderbolt pilots would climb above the bomber streams, scanning for the glint of enemy wings, rising to intercept. When German formations appeared, the Jugs rolled over, throttle wide open, and plunged from 30,000 feet like Thunderbolts in name and nature. The air screamed past at speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, speeds that could tear apart lighter aircraft. They would fire short, devastating bursts, 8.50 caliber guns spitting 100 rounds a second, and then pull up in a long, arcing zoom climb, using momentum to regain altitude. It was not about dogfighting. It was about controlled violence, measured, and precise. Luftwaffe pilots soon realized chasing a diving Thunderbolt was suicide. The German fighters, though agile, couldn't withstand the same speeds. Their control surfaces locked under compressibility, wings fluttered, engines overheated. The Jug, by contrast, dove cleanly, its massive airframe stable even past 500 miles per hour. The new doctrine was written in blood and adaptation. Boom and zoom, the art of the energy fight, became the signature of the P-47. This shift marked a philosophical change as well. The Thunderbolt wasn't about elegance or finesse. It was about momentum, patience, and precision. Every dive, every burst, was the culmination of geometry and timing. As Zemke famously told his pilots, "Don't turn, attack." At the heart of the Thunderbolt's power was the Pratt Whitney R-2800 double Wasp, one of the most advanced piston engines of the war. 18 cylinders arranged in 2 radial rows, producing over 2,000 horsepower. Fed by a turbo supercharger system that filled the rear fuselage, it allowed the engine to breathe freely at 30,000 feet. The air entered through side intakes, passed through intercoolers, and was compressed by the supercharger before feeding the carburetor. It was a mechanical symphony of pipes, turbines, and ducts, and it worked flawlessly. This made the P-47 a true high-altitude fighter. It could chase interceptors that tried to climb above the bomber formations, something few other American aircraft could manage early in the war. Its sheer bulk carried advantages beyond power. The large fuselage meant more room for fuel, heavy guns, and armor protection. The P-47's self-sealing fuel tanks were a marvel of redundancy. Even when punctured, the rubberized lining swelled upon contact with gasoline vapor, closing the wound. Maintenance crews loved the aircraft. Despite its complexity, the radial engine tolerated damage better than inline engines like those in the P-51 or Bf-109. Bullet holes could pierce cylinders without catastrophic failure. The R-2800 would cough, sputter, and keep running. The wings carried 8.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns mounted in perfectly harmonized pairs. The firepower was overwhelming. In test trials, it could destroy a medium bomber in a 3-second burst. On the battlefield, it could shred an FW-190 before the German pilot even saw who fired. The P-47's performance evolved rapidly. Early Razorback models gave way to the P-47D with a bubble canopy, granting unmatched visibility in the swirling dogfights above Europe. Engineers increased the fuel capacity, refined the propeller, and strengthened the wings for bomb racks. Each new variant turned the Jug from a defensive escort into a flying war machine capable of offense at every altitude. To the Luftwaffe, it seemed almost unfair, an enemy aircraft that could outdive, outgun, and outlast. To the Americans, it was engineering proof that brute force, when disciplined, could win the sky. By late 1943, the P-47 wasn't just protecting bombers anymore. It was starting to dominate the air war. But to truly understand its impact, we must see it from the eyes of those it terrified. To German pilots in 1943, the Thunderbolt was a shock wrapped in confusion. At first sight, it looked clumsy, big, broad, and, as one German pilot remarked, like a flying beer keg. But this illusion shattered the moment it moved. During the early months of combat, Luftwaffe interceptors, Bf-109GS and FW-190AS, rose with confidence to meet incoming bomber formations. They had long since mastered the rhythm: climb, attack the lead bombers, dive away, and reform. But then came the Thunderbolt, higher, faster, and devastatingly armed. In the chaos of contrails and tracer fire, German formation leaders noticed something alarming. The new American fighters weren't turning with them, they were striking in vertical dives. The FW-190 pilots, who once held an advantage in roll rate and acceleration, found themselves overmatched in sheer speed. Reports flooded Luftwaffe headquarters in late 1943. Field commanders described heavier, faster American escorts engaging at great height. Many assumed these were twin-engine aircraft. They were stunned to learn that the P-47 was a single-seat fighter. Worse still, their standard escape, The high-speed dive no longer worked. The P-47 could follow them all the way down. Bf-109s risked compressibility and structural failure beyond 480 miles per hour, but the Thunderbolt could dive past 500 with ease. German radio chatter during combat often captured the frustration. Sie kommen wieder herunter, die Dicken. They're diving again, the fat ones. Even seasoned aces like Adolf Galland took notice. Galland later admitted that the arrival of the P-47 marked a significant change in the air balance. The Americans could now protect their bombers longer, engage more freely, and survive damage that would have destroyed any German aircraft. For Luftwaffe mechanics, post-battle wreckage told the story. Many surviving pilots reported empty magazines and overheated engines, unable to down the thick-skinned American fighters. The Thunderbolt's armor shrugged off 20mm hits that would have torn lighter planes apart. Psychologically, this mattered as much as the combat statistics. German pilots began dreading the presence of P-47s over the bomber streams. The sound of the R-2800's thunderous growl became an omen. The balance of fear, for the first time since 1939, began to shift. Every great machine needs a leader who understands its nature. For the P-47, that leader was Colonel Hubert, Zemke. Zemke was not a man of bluster or showmanship. He was analytical, disciplined, and deeply aware of his aircraft's strengths and weaknesses. A pre-war Army Air Corps pilot and instructor, he approached air combat like a science experiment, each mission a data point, each mistake a lesson. When he took command of the 56 Fighter Group in England, morale was uncertain. The P-47 was new, its quirks many, and early losses had shaken confidence. Zemke transformed that doubt into purpose. He demanded discipline, formation integrity, fuel management, and precise gunnery. But he also encouraged autonomy. His men were to think like hunters, not escorts. He introduced new tactics, maintaining high altitude, attacking in coordinated pairs, using radio silence to surprise German formations. He also pioneered Zemke fan dispersal, spreading fighters ahead of bomber formations to sweep enemy interceptors before they could strike. His leadership reshaped not just one group, but the entire 8th Air Force fighter doctrine. Under Zemke, the 56th became the top-scoring unit in the European theater, credited with destroying over 665 enemy aircraft in the air and 311 on the ground. Pilots like Francis Gabreski and Robert S. Johnson became legends, their names synonymous with relentless precision and courage. But perhaps Zemke's greatest legacy was mental. He instilled in his men the belief that survival and aggression were not opposites. A pilot could be cautious, calculating, and still deadly. The Luftwaffe, once masters of the intercept, now faced opponents who fought with logic as sharp as their firepower. By 1944, the air war over Europe had become a battle of nerves. For Luftwaffe pilots, every sortie meant facing overwhelming numbers and dwindling experience. The elite veterans of 1940 were gone, replaced by teenagers trained in haste and thrown into impossible odds. Their aircraft were still formidable, the Bf-109G, the FW-190A-8, but their world had shrunk. For the Americans, the opposite was true. Their strength grew with every convoy, every replacement, every crate unloaded at English docks. Yet the emotional toll was real. Missions lasted 7 hours. Frostbite, oxygen starvation, and sheer fatigue haunted even the strongest men. Inside the P-47's cockpit, pilots fought isolation as much as the enemy. The roar of the engine was both companion and reminder. One mechanical failure, one flak burst, one moment of inattention, and they would fall alone into occupied Europe. Still, the Thunderbolt gave them something no other fighter could: faith. Faith in metal. Faith that even if every gauge went red, the aircraft would somehow bring them home. There was a psychological comfort in its durability. When you climbed into a P-47, you felt protected. That mattered in a war where courage was measured in seconds and survival in inches of armor. For German pilots, the same sound of faith became the sound of dread. They began calling the Thunderbolt der Brummer, the Growler. Its presence above the clouds signaled the end of easy hunts. As the months rolled on, the Jug became more than an escort. It became a symbol of persistence, industry, and inevitability. The skies over Europe, once a contested arena of equal foes, were now tilting. The Luftwaffe still fought with skill and desperation, but the tide was shifting, not by miracle, but by design. And that design would reach its full, brutal potential during the operation that changed the air war forever. By February 1944, the Allied air campaign had reached a breaking point. Losses from deep penetration raids were unsustainable. Morale among bomber crews was stretched thin, and the Luftwaffe, though weakened, still dominated its home skies. The American 8th Air Force needed a decisive blow, not just against targets, but against the very heart of Germany's fighter production. The plan was audacious, Operation Argument. The men would come to call it simply Big Week. From February 20th to 25th, 1944, waves of American and British bombers would strike German aircraft factories, assembly plants, and component works, Regensburg, Gotha, Leipzig, Augsburg, Stuttgart, and others. The goal was not only to destroy the machines, but to lure the Luftwaffe into the open. To kill the hunters, not just their nests. For the first time, the operation would be accompanied by full-scale escort coverage, and at its spearhead, the P-47 Thunderbolt. The morning of February 20th dawned clear and frigid across England's airfields. At Boxstead, Halesworth, and Horsham St. Faith, mechanics worked through the night, loading ammunition belts, attaching drop tanks, and checking every feed line of the R-2800s. Frost glimmered on the metal skin of hundreds of P-47DS, the air thick with the scent of high-octane fuel. Pilots sat in briefing rooms, their maps stretched across tables, tracing routes deep into Germany. Escort to Gotha. Target, Messerschmitt Factory Complex. There were no illusions about the danger. When engines roared to life, the earth trembled. Dozens of Thunderbolts lumbered down the runways, climbing steadily to meet the silver formations of B-17s forming above the English coast. The sky over Europe that week was chaos, organized chaos. Thousands of aircraft, hundreds of contrails, flat bursts blooming like dark flowers. The Luftwaffe responded immediately. From bases at Augsburg, Braunschweig, and Wiesbaden, Gruppen scrambled their fighters, Bf-109GS, FW-190AS, and a handful of twin-engine Zerstors. Their mission, cut down the bombers before they reached their targets. They rose through the cloud decks and found the bomber streams, but this time, something was different. The escorts didn't turn back. At 25,000 feet, the P-47s held formation alongside the bombers, engines howling, guns armed. The German pilots, used to seeing escorts peel away near the border, pressed their attacks regardless, and flew straight into an ambush. Hub Zemke's Wolfpack led the first major engagement over Hanover. Radar reports showed dozens of German interceptors converging on the bomber stream from the east. Zemke split his squadrons into climbing arcs, using altitude to gain energy. Then came his calm radio order, "Let's go hunting." The Thunderbolts rolled into their dives. The sky erupted. German formations shattered under the first slashing attack. The P-47s used their superior dive speed to strike from above, then zoom climb to reposition. Bf-109s tried to follow, a fatal mistake. Their wings stiffened, their engines screamed under strain, and their pilots blacked out in compressibility dives. Lieutenant Gabreski's guns tore apart an FW-190 before the German could even roll away. Moments later, Johnson and his wingmen downed two more. Within minutes, the radio net was filled with victory calls and frantic warnings. "Watch your six. They're diving again, Jugs." Jugs everywhere. Across central Germany, similar scenes unfolded. P-47 groups from the 4th, 56th, and 353rd Fighter Groups intercepted enemy interceptors before they could even reach the bombers. Instead of protecting, they hunted. The Luftwaffe had walked into a trap of its own making. Each engagement drained its reserves of trained pilots and fuel. Repair shops couldn't keep up with the mounting losses. For every aircraft the Germans shot down, 2 of their own failed to return. The results were devastating. In 6 days, the Allies flew more than 3,000 bomber sorties and 3,000 fighter sorties. The Luftwaffe lost nearly a third of its operational fighter force. Factories like Regensburg and Gotha were in ruins. Production fell sharply, not because the machines were gone, but because the men who flew them were. For the American bomber crews, the difference was palpable. For the first time, Thunderbolts escorted them home. Pilots returning to base described the rare feeling of seeing fighters beside them all the way across the channel. One gunner from the 100th Bomb Group wrote in his diary that night, "They didn't leave us. Not once. The jugs were there when the flak started and still there when we turned west. God bless those big bastards." By the end of Big Week, the German command structure was shaken. Luftwaffe General Adolf Galland admitted privately that the Air Force could no longer maintain its former dominance. Too many veterans were gone. Too many aircraft were lost. The P-47 had done what no one thought possible. It had taken a fight deep into the Reich and survived it. But the campaign was not over. The skies of Europe were changing, and with them, the very purpose of the Thunderbolt itself. The next phase would not just decide who ruled the air, but who controlled the future of the war. The months following Big Week marked a transformation not just in the balance of the air war, but in its very nature. The P-47 Thunderbolt, once a defensive guardian tied to bomber streams, became an aggressive weapon of air domination. By March 1944, the Luftwaffe's veteran squadrons were depleted. The loss of skilled pilots had left the once feared Jägerschwader units filled with hastily trained replacements, men who had logged barely 100 flight hours, many of them on obsolete trainers. The sky that had once belonged to Germany was now a vast killing ground, patrolled by Allied fighters with no limits on altitude or reach. And the P-47, though soon joined by the long-range P-51 Mustang, remained the brutal fist of the Allied air forces. In the weeks after Big Week, Thunderbolt groups intensified their operations. No longer content to merely protect bombers, they were unleashed as offensive predators. The new doctrine was simple: seek, engage, and destroy anything that could fly or move. They prowled ahead of bomber streams, sweeping the skies clean before the heavy formations arrived. They struck enemy airfields, catching Bf-109s and Fw-190s as they were taking off or landing, moments when they were most vulnerable. One German survivor, Unteroffizier Hans-Ulrich Wise of JG-11, recalled, "You cannot take off without feeling hunted. The Americans own the sun now. They came from above, always above." These fighter sweeps devastated German air operations. Every airfield within range became a target. Thunderbolts roared low over runways, their 8 machine guns ripping through parked aircraft and fuel trucks. Ammunition dumps exploded in blossoms of flame. Even air traffic controllers became victims, strafed in their towers as jugs screamed overhead. This new phase of the air war broke the Luftwaffe's rhythm. No longer able to mass formations for interception, German units were scattered and reactive. The P-47s dictated when and where battles occurred. The numbers tell the story. Between March and May 1944, the 8th Air Force's P-47 groups flew over 22,000 sorties and destroyed more than 1,000 German aircraft in the air and on the ground. The Luftwaffe's losses became unsustainable. But the shift wasn't only tactical, it was psychological. For American pilots, confidence had turned to dominance. The P-47's bubble canopy, introduced with the D-25 variant, gave unparalleled visibility. Pilots could now see in every direction, removing the blind spot that had once cost lives. Combined with the Thunderbolt's unmatched dive performance and firepower, this created a sense of invincibility. In combat footage from early 1944, you can see the transformation. Gone were the defensive turns and rigid formations of the previous year. Now the P-47s moved like wolves, independent, coordinated by instinct rather than order. Zemke's Wolfpack epitomized this evolution. His squadrons began flying roving patrols, breaking from bomber formations to attack enemy airfields at will. The results were devastating. On April 8, 1944, Zemke led a mission over northwestern Germany that resulted in 31 confirmed kills, the highest single-day total for any fighter group in the European theater. The Luftwaffe never recovered from such hemorrhages. Even the famed Schwarms, the German four-plane tactical units that had once terrorized the skies, could not stand against the onslaught. They were outnumbered, outclimbed, and outdived. By May, the airspace over Western Europe was effectively under Allied control. The Luftwaffe, now desperate, turned to new technologies, rocket interceptors like the Me-163 Comet and jet fighters like the Me-262. But they came too late, in too few numbers, and with too little fuel. For the P-47s, the mission evolved again. Their massive airframes, once designed for high-altitude duels, proved perfect for carrying bombs, rockets, and drop tanks. They became J-bows, fighter bombers, capable of blasting rail yards, convoys, and bridges in the lead-up to the Normandy invasion. The transition from air duels to ground annihilation was seamless. The same rugged design that made the Thunderbolt a survivor in dogfights now made it the most effective ground attack aircraft in Europe. General Karl Spaatz, commander of U.S. Strategic Air Forces in Europe, remarked in a field report, "The P-47's adaptability is its genius. It is as deadly to locomotives as it is to Focke-Wulfs." But amid the triumph, there was tragedy. The air over Germany was still lethal. Flak concentrations near industrial cities were dense enough to blacken the sky, and every Thunderbolt pilot knew that even a single hit from a well-placed 88mm shell could end their life instantly. The difference was that now, the odds favored the Americans. By the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe was no longer a coherent fighting force. What remained were scattered units, broken morale, and overworked mechanics patching together aircraft from wreckage. One German ace, Gunther Röhl, later summarized it with grim simplicity: "We were not beaten by better pilots. We were beaten by more of them, and by machines that did not die." The sky that had once belonged to the Reich was now Allied territory. When June 6, 1944, D-Day, arrived, the P-47s were everywhere. They swept the beaches of Normandy, strafed columns, and bombed bridges with surgical ferocity. Above the invasion fleet, there was no Luftwaffe presence of consequence. The Thunderbolt's roar was the sound of air supremacy made real. In less than a year, the balance of Europe's air war had been reversed. And it began with the moment German pilots realized, too late, that the fat American was faster, tougher, and deadlier than anything they had ever faced. By the end of 1944, the once proud Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. What had begun as a finely tuned defensive network, radar stations, flak belts, and disciplined Jageschwader formations had dissolved into scattered fragments, outnumbered and overwhelmed. The numbers told a story colder and more final than any combat report. During the 12 months following Big Week, the Luftwaffe lost more than 18,000 aircraft destroyed or damaged beyond repair. Its pilot losses were catastrophic, more than 5,000 trained airmen killed or captured, men who could never be replaced at the pace Germany's collapsing training system demanded. The Americans, too, paid dearly. Between 1943 and 1945, the 8th Air Force alone lost over 26,000 men in Europe, many of them bomber crews. But the difference was industrial endurance. Every Thunderbolt lost could be replaced. Every pilot shot down, if he survived, could return to the fight. Germany no longer had that luxury. The P-47 had become a machine of attrition, and in a war of attrition, it was unbeatable. In combat reports filed from late 1944, Luftwaffe squadron leaders used a word rarely seen before: Übermacht, overpowering force. The term described not just numerical superiority, but the feeling of inevitability. The Thunderbolt had become an emblem of that inevitability. German ground crews learned to recognize the sound of its approach. The deep, drumming roar of the R-2800 was unmistakable, echoing through airfields long before the aircraft came into view. Pilots scrambled half-ready, often taking off under fire. Some never left the ground. By now, the P-47 had evolved into multiple specialized forms. Fighter groups rotated between air superiority patrols, bomber escort, and fighter-bomber missions that struck airfields directly. Reports from reconnaissance units over France and Western Germany showed hundreds of German aircraft destroyed on the ground each month, many of them caught while refueling or rearming. Even when the Luftwaffe did rise, the odds were hopeless. An engagement on November 26, 1944, over the Rhine, told the story. A formation of FW-190s attempted to intercept U.S. bombers heading toward industrial Cologne. They never reached them. The 56 Fighter Group pounced at 27,000 feet, diving from the sun. In less than 10 minutes, the P-47s downed 16 German fighters for the loss of one Thunderbolt. The scale of such battles broke not only the Luftwaffe's capacity to fight, but its spirit. German pilots entered the air knowing that every flight might be their last. Some flew without radio contact, others without working instruments, fueled by desperation and duty. Allied intelligence analysts studying intercepted communications noticed the change in tone. Messages once crisp and confident became erratic, emotional, and often fatalistic. Phrases like "cane chance," "no chance," appeared in post-mission debriefs. For the Americans, this shift was visible in the sky itself. Where once Luftwaffe contrails had crossed theirs in angry white arcs, the upper atmosphere now seemed eerily empty. Bomber crews noted it in their diaries. Missions that once meant constant combat now ended with untouched ammunition belts. The P-47s, however, did not rest. Every day they pressed deeper, beyond the Ruhr, across the Rhine, toward Frankfurt and Munich. Their attacks were no longer about defense, they were about suffocation. In raw numbers, the transformation was staggering. Between January and June 1944, the U.S. Army Air Forces achieved a 2-to-1 kill ratio over the Luftwaffe. By the end of that year, the ratio had climbed to 10-to-1 in favor of Allied fighters. The Thunderbolt accounted for a massive share of these kills. Its pilots, many barely in their 20s, became seasoned veterans in months. The names of their units, 56th, 78th, 353rd, 362nd, became synonymous with air dominance. And yet, the cost of that dominance was human. Each Thunderbolt returning to England carried the echoes of its fallen wingmen. Empty bunks in barracks, unclaimed mugs in mess halls, bullet holes patched in fuselages, these were the silent reminders of victory's price. But war, by then, had lost any illusion of glory. It was about endurance. And in endurance, the Thunderbolt was supreme. As the winter of 1944 turned to 1945, the P-47's purpose shifted once more. The Luftwaffe was no longer the primary enemy. Now the Jug's firepower was turned downward to the bridges, roads, and armored columns of a collapsing Reich. The same guns that once tore apart German fighters would soon rake across the battlefields of Normandy and beyond. By the spring of 1944, the Thunderbolt's dominance in the air was assured. But the war demanded more than mastery of the skies. The coming Allied invasion of Europe required control over the ground beneath them, bridges, railways, supply convoys, and tanks that could threaten the beaches of Normandy. And so the P-47 evolved again. The fighter became a J-bow, short for Jag bomber, the German term for a fighter bomber. The name fit perfectly, for the Jug could do what few aircraft could, take punishment from ground fire, deliver devastating strikes, and still return home in one piece. The transformation began quietly in late 1943, with experimental bomb racks fitted under the wings of the P-47D. By mid-1944, the aircraft was carrying 500 or 1,000-pound bombs and 5-inch high-velocity rockets, turning it into a flying sledgehammer. Its 8.50 caliber machine guns remained, ensuring that anything left standing after the bombs fell was swiftly reduced to rubble. The targets were endless: German trains, troop columns, armored vehicles, and fuel depots. Each day, Thunderbolt groups launched hundreds of sorties, sweeping across France, Belgium, and Western Germany. They struck bridges over the Seine, ambushed convoys on narrow country roads, and attacked supply lines feeding the Atlantic Wall. One of the most feared tactics was rail cutting. Thunderbolts would patrol known railway lines, waiting for the distant glint of a moving locomotive. When spotted, they descended in steep, screaming dives, guns blazing. The first rounds tore through the engine cabin, the rest ripped open fuel cars, igniting spectacular infernos. German transport crews called these attacks Die Halle von oben, Hell from above. The effect on German logistics was devastating. Supply trains were forced to move only at night. Tanks ran dry before reaching the front. Bridges destroyed by Thunderbolts slowed reinforcement movements by days or weeks, time the Allies used to prepare for the invasion. Even flak crews grew wary. The P-47 could absorb hits that would cripple lighter aircraft. Many German gunners reported their shock at seeing a damaged jug pull up from a strafing run trailing smoke, only to circle back for another pass. When the morning of June 6, 1944 arrived, the P-47 Thunderbolt was ready. Before dawn, squadrons lifted off from English fields in endless waves. The sky above the channel filled with their heavy silhouettes, each carrying bombs, rockets, and the confidence of countless missions before. Their job was clear: suppress everything that could move against the invasion force. As the first landing craft approached the beaches, the jugs were already striking. They blasted pillboxes, machine gun nests, and artillery batteries hidden along the coastline. Others flew cab-rank patrols, circling above the invasion zone, awaiting calls from forward observers on the ground. When paratroopers of the 101st and 82nd Airborne found themselves pinned down near Saint-Mire-Église, Thunderbolts responded within minutes. Their bombs ripped through hedgerows and German positions, clearing the way for the troops below. By nightfall, P-47s had flown hundreds of sorties. Not a single German counterattack reached the beaches unscathed. A pilot from the 362nd Fighter Group later wrote, "Every time we looked down, something was burning. Trains, trucks, tanks, everything that moved. The jug was everywhere." The Luftwaffe tried to respond, but their presence was a whisper compared to the roar above. Allied pilots roamed freely. The few German aircraft that took off were swiftly intercepted, often before they even reached the front. As the Allies advanced through France, the P-47 became the spearhead of tactical air power. From temporary airstrips carved into farmland, jugs flew multiple missions a day, bombing bridges in the morning and strafing convoys by evening. Their durability became legendary. Many aircraft returned riddled with flak holes, missing control surfaces or leaking oil, yet still able to land safely. Maintenance crews patched them overnight, and by dawn they were back in the sky. By late 1944, the P-47 was flying deep into Germany again, but now its targets were rail yards, fuel depots, and retreating columns. In a cruel twist of fate, the Luftwaffe's last remaining aircraft often died not in dogfights, but while grounded, caught by jugs that swooped down like executioners. The once proud German air defense network had been broken not only in the air but on the ground. When the Allies crossed the Rhine in early 1945, the Thunderbolt led the way, clearing the skies, silencing the roads, and announcing, through the deep roar of its engine, that the war's end was near. The P-47 had begun its life as an experiment in over-engineering, a fighter too big, too heavy, too strange. By the end of the war, it had become the symbol of Allied power, the sound of thunder that rolled over Europe until the guns finally fell silent. And yet its story wasn't only about steel and fire. It was about endurance, adaptation, and the will to win when the odds seemed impossible. The German pilots who once laughed at the flying barrel had long since stopped laughing. They now looked to the skies, hearing the distant rumble that had haunted them since 1943. That sound meant only one thing: the Thunderbolts were coming. The war in Europe ended with cities in ruins and skies finally quiet, but for those who had lived and fought above the clouds, silence was almost unnatural. For 2 years, the sound of thunder had not come from the heavens. It had come from machines, from the deep, mechanical growl of the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. What made the P-47 P-47 extraordinary was not beauty, nor agility, nor glamour. It was endurance. In a war defined by innovation and speed, the Jug proved that survival was the ultimate form of victory. It was a machine built not for elegance but for staying power, the kind that wears an enemy down one mission, one sortie, one strike at a time. When German pilots first met the Thunderbolt, they saw a heavy brute, unfit for the delicate dance of aerial combat. But what they underestimated was its resilience and the industrial might behind it. Every P-47 that returned home carried with it the sum of American engineering, logistics, and learning. Every one that fell was replaced by another, improved, refined, more deadly than before. The Luftwaffe fought with courage. Their skill was unmatched, their spirit unbroken even as the odds closed in. But courage alone could not overcome exhaustion. It could not match a war machine that learned faster than it bled. The P-47 Thunderbolt became more than a fighter. It became a philosophy, win not by chance, but by design, through endurance, through consistency, through the unwavering belief that preparation and discipline could outlast brilliance and fear. When the airmen of the 56 Fighter Group looked back on their missions, many spoke less of triumph than of survival. They remembered the smell of hot oil, the frost on the canopy, the endless sky where life and death danced in seconds. Yet, through all of it, they trusted one constant, the rumble of the Jug beneath them. It was the sound that carried them home. And when peace finally returned, that sound, that deep, rolling thunder, remained etched in memory. A reminder of an age when courage flew on steel wings, and the sky itself bore witness to a machine that turned doubt into dominance and fear into flight. The machine that taught the world that even in the coldest, highest reaches of war, endurance roars louder than fear.